By the mid-1840s, Queen Victoria was no longer the youthful bride overwhelmed by her first pregnancy. She was now a mother of several children, her household bustling with noise and activity. Yet behind palace doors, the Queen confessed to being exhausted, irritated, and sometimes resentful of the constant cycle of pregnancy. Over the course of 17 years, she would give birth to 9 children, a staggering number, even by 19th century standards. And in the process, she would change the way society viewed both pregnancy and pain itself. Victoria's children came in rapid succession. After Princess Victoria in 1840, came Prince Albert Edward later, King Edward VII in 1841. Then followed Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and finally, Beatrice in 1857. Each pregnancy brought the same struggles. She complained of nausea, swelling, fatigue, and the endless restrictions imposed on her body. She described pregnancy as the shadow side of marriage and admitted, "I do not like babies." Such frank words were shocking for a queen who, in the public imagination, was meant to embody domestic virtue. Yet, paradoxically, Victoria also loved her children once they were born, delighting in their personalities and quirks. Her letters reveal a woman who, while impatient with the trials of motherhood, nevertheless felt genuine pride in her growing brood. It is difficult to exaggerate just how dangerous pregnancy and childbirth were in Victoria's era. Every birth was a gamble with death. Maternal mortality rates in Britain were high. Thousands of women died each year from complications such as hemorrhage, obstructed labor, or infection. Doctors of the time did not yet understand germs. Hand washing, antiseptics, and sterile instruments were not widely practiced. In fact, the presence of doctors sometimes made childbirth more dangerous. Midwives, often derided as old-fashioned, were ironically less likely to spread infection than physicians who moved directly from autopsies to the birthing chamber without washing their hands. Victoria's survival through 9 pregnancies was, in many ways, remarkable. But she did not emerge unscathed. Her health was often weakened, and the cumulative strain of childbirth took a lasting toll on her body. The defining moment in the history of Queen Victoria and pregnancy came in 1853, during the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold. By this point, medicine had advanced slightly. Chloroform, an anesthetic discovered in 1831, had begun to be used experimentally in surgery, but its use in childbirth was controversial. Many doctors and clergymen argued that relieving women's pain in labor was unnatural and even sinful. They cited the Bible. "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children," Genesis 3:16. For them, the agony of childbirth was divinely ordained. But Victoria disagreed. In 1853, she requested chloroform during her labor with Leopold, administered by Dr. John Snow, who would later become famous for tracing the spread of cholera. Victoria inhaled the anesthetic and found welcome relief. She described the experience as soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure. Her endorsement was revolutionary. If the Queen of England could use chloroform, then it must be respectable. Overnight, the social stigma around pain relief in childbirth began to vanish. Middle and upper-class women across Britain now demanded it. Victoria's use of chloroform had a ripple effect beyond childbirth. It helped pave the way for broader acceptance of anesthesia in medicine as a whole. The Queen's influence made it fashionable, respectable, and morally acceptable to embrace modern medical science. This was not merely a private choice. It reshaped public opinion. For centuries, women had suffered through childbirth with little more than herbal remedies or comforting words. Now, thanks to Victoria's example, pain relief became a legitimate part of maternity care. It is striking to think that one queen's decision in a palace chamber could change the course of medical history. But such was the symbolic power of monarchy in the Victorian age. For Prince Albert, Fatherhood was both a source of pride and responsibility. He was deeply involved in the upbringing of their children, often more so than Victoria herself. He managed their education, set rules, and oversaw discipline. But for Victoria, the constant pregnancies strained her marriage. At times, she blamed Albert for her endless childbearing. She even confessed to feeling as though she was little more than a vessel, deprived of freedom by her duty as wife and queen. Yet the couple's bond remained strong. Their relationship was affectionate, often tender, but also marked by tension. Victoria depended on Albert emotionally, while Albert sometimes grew frustrated with her moods and complaints. Parenthood, like marriage, tested them both. Each child brought its own joys and challenges. Albert Edward, known as Bertie, was a constant source of worry to his parents, who feared he would never live up to his royal role. Alice, sensitive and caring, became one of Victoria's favorites. Alfred followed a naval career, while Louise grew into a spirited young woman who later supported the arts. Yet the very size of the family was itself overwhelming. Victoria admitted to feeling trapped in what she described as an endless chain of pregnancy and confinement. She often delegated childbearing to governesses and nannies, intervening more selectively than Albert. To the public, however, she represented the ideal of domestic motherhood. Paintings and prints celebrated her as the model mother of the nation, surrounded by her children in happy family scenes. The reality was far more complicated. Though Victoria survived her pregnancies, tragedy still loomed. Her eighth child, Prince Leopold, was born with hemophilia, a genetic condition that prevented blood from clotting properly. This disease would cause him great suffering and ultimately contribute to his early death at the age of 30. The presence of hemophilia in Victoria's descendants would have consequences across Europe, as her children married into royal families and carried the disease with them. In this sense, her pregnancies not only shaped Britain, but also influenced the genetic fate of entire dynasties. By the late 1850s, Queen Victoria had endured 8 pregnancies, countless hours of labor, and the ever-present fear of death in childbirth. And yet, she had also changed the landscape of maternity care forever. Her decision to embrace chloroform helped redefine childbirth, making pain relief not only acceptable, but fashionable. Still, the Queen's personal feelings about pregnancy remained unchanged. She loathed the process, resented the toll it took on her body and her freedom, and confessed her dislike of babies. But duty was duty, and Victoria continued to fulfill hers. In the final part of our story, we'll see how Victoria's later pregnancies, her health struggles, and her role as mother of the nation shaped both her family and her legacy. And we'll ask, how did a queen who so despised pregnancy become the ultimate symbol of motherhood in the modern age? By the late 1850s, Queen Victoria had given birth to 8 children, and her body bore the strain of nearly 2 decades of pregnancy. Yet the cycle was not finished. In 1857, at the age of 38, she became pregnant for the 9th and final time. This last pregnancy, while no less difficult than the others, marked the end of a chapter in Victoria's life. But even as she stepped away from the physical burden of motherhood, she could not escape its symbolic weight. For the rest of her reign, she would be remembered, celebrated, and sometimes mocked as the ultimate mother of the nation. On April 14, 1857, Victoria gave birth to her youngest child, Princess Beatrice. By this time, the Queen was weary of childbearing. She was approaching 40, an age when pregnancy was far more dangerous. Her health had already been weakened by years of confinement and recovery. And yet, Beatrice was born healthy, and Victoria, though exhausted, endured the ordeal once more. Beatrice would become the Queen's constant companion in later years, especially after the death of Prince Albert. Ironically, the child whose arrival Victoria had dreaded most would become her greatest comfort in old age. 9 pregnancies left deep marks on Victoria's physical and emotional health. She struggled with postpartum depression, a condition poorly understood at the time. After the birth of her 9th child, she wrote bitterly about the endless sacrifices of motherhood. She also suffered from physical ailments. Varicose veins, weight gain, and persistent pain plagued her in later years. Combined with her grief after Albert's death in 1861, these struggles contributed to the image of Victoria as a stern, melancholy figure. Yet behind this somber exterior was a woman who had endured the most intimate of trials again and again and survived. Victoria's paradoxical relationship with motherhood remained a defining feature of her life. She loathed pregnancy, calling it an animal condition, yet she cherished her role as a matriarch. Her letters reveal deep affection for her children, even if she could be harsh in her judgments. Her relationship with her children was complicated. She adored some, especially her daughters Alice and Beatrice, while often criticizing others, particularly Bertie, her heir. She viewed him as frivolous, irresponsible, and unfit for the crown, though he would later prove himself a capable king. Still, Victoria's large family became central to her identity. As she grew older, she reveled in the presence of her children and grandchildren, even as she continued to grumble about the hardships that had brought them into the world. In the eyes of the public, Queen Victoria became the embodiment of motherhood. Paintings, engravings, and photographs depicted her surrounded by her children, the perfect image of domestic virtue. This image was carefully cultivated. At a time when Britain was undergoing rapid industrialization, urbanization, and social upheaval, Victoria's family life offered a reassuring symbol of stability. She was not just the sovereign, she was the mother of a growing, prosperous nation. The irony, of course, was that Victoria herself disliked being pregnant and often complained about her children. But image mattered more than reality, and Victoria's reputation as the great royal mother became one of the defining features of her reign. Victoria's role as mother extended far beyond Britain. Through strategic marriages, her children linked the British royal family with dynasties across Europe. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, married the future German emperor. Alice married into the Hessian royal family. Alfred with a Russian Grand Duchess. And so on until Victoria's descendants occupied thrones in Germany, Russia, Greece, Norway, and Spain. By the late 19th century, she was known as the grandmother of Europe. Her pregnancies, which she had so despised, had produced a network of dynastic alliances that shaped European politics for generations. Even the tragic spread of hemophilia, a condition carried by Victoria and passed on to several of her descendants, was part of this legacy. Victoria's identity as mother was not only personal but also political. At a time when monarchies across Europe were under pressure, her image as a devoted wife and mother helped reinforce the legitimacy of the crown. Unlike earlier queens, who had been criticized for being too political or too frivolous, Victoria presented herself as both domestic and dutiful. This image resonated deeply with the values of Victorian Britain, where family life and morality were prized above all. Even her use of chloroform in childbirth carried political weight, signaling that the monarchy could embrace modern science while still embodying tradition. When Victoria died in 1901, she left behind not just an empire, but a family tree that stretched across Europe. Her 9 children, 42 grandchildren, and nearly 90 great-grandchildren carried her legacy into the 20th century. And yet, her private writings remind us that this legacy came at a personal cost. For Victoria, pregnancy was not a joy but a burden. She endured it out of duty, not desire. Her honesty about her dislike of pregnancy remains rare among historical figures, and it humanizes her in a way that few other monarchs have ever been. Queen Victoria never wanted to be remembered as the mother of 9. She would have preferred to be remembered for her devotion to Albert, her influence on politics, or her role as a ruler. And yet, history had other plans. Her pregnancies, which she privately despised, became the foundation of her public image. Her embrace of chloroform reshaped medical practice. Her children transformed European politics. And her paradoxical stance, hating pregnancy but embodying motherhood, captured the contradictions of her age. In the end, Victoria was both a queen and a woman, torn between personal discomfort and public duty. And though she saw pregnancy as a curse, it became one of the greatest legacies of her reign. When most people picture Queen Victoria, they imagine the stern, black-clad widow who ruled Britain for more than 60 years. But before she became the matriarch of an empire, Victoria was a young bride, barely out of her teens, facing the realities of pregnancy in the 19th century. And those realities were not the romanticized vision of motherhood that polite society preferred to promote. They were dangerous, exhausting, and if we believe Victoria's own words, something she loathed with a passion. This is the story of how the young queen navigated the trials of marriage, pregnancy, and childbirth, not as an abstract monarch, but as a woman whose private complaints reveal just how perilous motherhood was in the Victorian era. By the time Victoria became queen in 1837, she was just 18 years old. She was young, energetic, and determined to assert her independence. For the first few years of her reign, she relished her freedom. She was unmarried, and she famously enjoyed the company of her close advisor, Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister. At this stage of her life, marriage and especially children were far from her mind. Yet in 1840, she married her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Their relationship, while beginning in the usual dynastic tradition, quickly developed into a genuine love match. The two were affectionate, intellectually engaged, and devoted to one another. But with that marriage came expectations. An heir to the throne, and plenty of royal offspring to secure the dynasty. What neither Victoria nor Albert anticipated was just how relentless that expectation would be. Over the course of their marriage, Victoria would give birth to 9 children. And for a woman who detested pregnancy, this became a lifelong burden. Victoria's first pregnancy began almost immediately after her marriage. Within weeks, she was expecting her first child. In her private journals and letters, Victoria was remarkably candid about how much she despised the experience. She described pregnancy as wretched and an irritation. She hated the physical changes, the discomfort, and the sense of losing control over her own body. In an era when modesty was prized, and women were expected to bear these changes silently, Victoria's frankness is startling. In December 1840, she gave birth to her first daughter, also named Victoria, in Buckingham Palace. The labor was long and excruciating, as was typical for the time. Pain relief options were limited, and the presence of doctors often did little more than reassure rather than truly assist. Yet the birth was celebrated across Britain. For the public, this was not just the arrival of a child, it was proof of stability for the monarchy, and confirmation that Victoria was fulfilling her royal duty. Behind palace doors, however, the young queen admitted to hating the ordeal. To understand Victoria's perspective, we need to consider the state of medicine in the 19th century. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Maternal mortality rates were alarmingly high. Infections like puerperal fever could strike without warning, often caused by unsanitary conditions or even transmitted by doctors who failed to wash their hands between patients. Pain relief was practically non-existent in the 1840s. Ether and chloroform were experimental and controversial. For a queen, the medical risks were slightly reduced by access to the best physicians. But even the best doctors of the day did not fully understand infection, germs, or proper hygiene. Victoria may have been the most powerful woman in the world, but in the birthing chamber, she was just as vulnerable as any of her subjects. It would be a mistake to say Victoria disliked her children. She often expressed affection for them, and in moments of reflection, was proud of her growing family. But she consistently complained about the process of bringing them into the world. Pregnancy, she wrote, takes away one's liberty. She felt imprisoned by the endless cycle of conception, gestation, and childbirth. And as the pregnancies continued, one after another, her frustration grew. This bluntness shocked many Victorians, who believed women should embrace motherhood as their natural destiny. But Victoria's complaints also resonated with countless women who silently felt the same way. The difference was that most of them could never admit it. One of the central themes of Victoria's life was the constant tension between her private desires and her public duties. As a woman, she longed for independence, freedom, and the companionship of Albert without constant interruption. As a queen, she was duty-bound to produce heirs. Her first child, Princess Victoria, was followed quickly by more. The queen would spend the majority of her married life either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or caring for infants. It was a cycle that left her exhausted and often resentful. And yet, she recognized that this was part of the royal role. To secure the dynasty, she had no choice. The British public saw her as the embodiment of motherhood, the mother of the nation. In reality, she often felt like a prisoner of her own fertility. For Prince Albert, fatherhood was both a joy and a burden. He adored children, but he also took his role as royal organizer and moral reformer seriously. He frequently intervened in how the children were raised, sometimes to Victoria's irritation. During her pregnancies, Victoria often relied on Albert emotionally. Yet she also blamed him for her constant state of pregnancy, writing at times with open bitterness. Their love remained strong, but the repeated cycle of pregnancies put undeniable strain on their marriage. Albert, ever the disciplinarian, sometimes treated Victoria more like one of the children than his equal partner. This dynamic grew more pronounced as the family expanded, and Victoria's sense of frustration only deepened. By the early 1840s, Queen Victoria had entered a phase of her life that would define her for decades. The reluctant but dutiful mother. She adored her husband, cherished her children in moments of affection, but despised the process of bringing them into the world. Her words reveal a woman at odds with the idealized image of motherhood promoted in her era. And yet, precisely because of her honesty, she offers us a rare glimpse into the real experiences of women in the 19th century. Victoria may have been a queen, but when it came to pregnancy and childbirth, she was just another woman enduring the pains, fears, and frustrations of motherhood in a dangerous age. In the next part, we'll explore how Victoria's repeated pregnancies shaped not just her private life, but also the history of medicine, and how one queen's labor pains changed the course of childbirth forever.